He was a 43-year-old homeless Navy SEAL veteran, and after losing his wife and too many brothers in war, Dan Miller believed Ranger was the only family he had left. No home, no steady job, no place to belong, just an aging Chevrolet Tahoe, a faded backpack, painful memories of Afghanistan, and the loyal German Shepherd he had once carried nearly 2 miles to safety. Then, one autumn afternoon in Colorado Springs, everything changed. Ranger suddenly heard a desperate scream beyond the fence of a sprawling estate and raced toward it. A young woman had been thrown violently from her horse and lay injured and unable to stand. Dan climbed the fence and followed Ranger using the instincts he thought he had left behind in Afghanistan to keep her conscious until help arrived. Her name was Sophie Harrison. Dan had no idea that saving her would open the gates of a wealthy but broken family, or that hidden inside their home was something connected to a dying soldier Dan and Ranger had desperately tried to save 6 years earlier. Before we begin, please subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Late September settled over Colorado Springs with thin mountain light, dry wind, and cold gathering early beneath the shadow of the Front Range. Daniel Dan Miller was 43 and looked older whenever he thought no one was watching. He stood just over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders despite the weight he had lost, with short, dark brown hair turning gray at the temples, a weathered face, blue-gray eyes, and a neatly trimmed beard that could not hide the exhaustion carved around his mouth. A faint scar crossed his left eyebrow. Once, strangers had noticed the disciplined posture of a Navy SEAL. Now they usually noticed the worn brown canvas jacket, red plaid flannel shirt, faded gray t-shirt, dark jeans, brown hiking boots, and the military backpack that carried nearly everything he owned. For more than a year, home had been an aging Chevrolet Tahoe parked wherever nobody asked too many questions. Ranger never asked any. The 9-year-old male German Shepherd had served beside Dan as a military working dog, and age had begun to silver the black and tan fur around his muzzle. His amber eyes remained sharp, his black saddle still dark across his back, and a small scar nicked the tip of his left ear. He wore an old brown leather collar instead of tactical gear now. Ranger moved more slowly after long walks, especially when his hind legs stiffened in the cold, but his attention never wandered far from Dan. If Dan stopped, Ranger stopped. If Dan woke from a nightmare gasping inside the Tahoe, Ranger pressed his heavy head against Dan's chest until the past loosened its grip. Before the Navy, Dan had been a mechanic's son in Ohio. His father, a quiet, square-handed man who believed more in work than speeches, had taught him engines, generators, carpentry, and patience. Before you throw something away, his father used to say, find out why it broke. Dan had believed that applied to almost everything. Then war taught him otherwise. In 2013, during an operation in Afghanistan, Ranger had located a badly wounded American serviceman beneath shattered concrete after an attack. Dan and his closest friend, Chris Walker, dragged the man free and carried him toward evacuation. Chris had been 35 then, lean and long-faced, with sandy hair, a crooked nose from an old training accident, and the irritating habit of making jokes when everyone else was terrified. He had been the kind of man who remembered birthdays, wrote to his mother every Sunday, and could calm a frightened young operator with one sentence and a grin. The wounded man died before reaching the larger base. Dan never learned much about him. 2 years later, Chris died too. That death lived differently inside Dan. He had replayed the mission so often that every second had become a courtroom. He remembered the delay, the wrong route, the moment he had chosen to wait instead of move. Rationally, he knew combat offered no clean answers. Emotionally, he had sentenced himself years ago. Ranger had been wounded during that same operation. Dan had carried the dog nearly 2 kilometers toward evacuation, Ranger's blood warming the front of his uniform while Dan repeated the same words until his throat went raw. Don't leave me, partner. Ranger had not. By 2016, both were retired, but Dan discovered that leaving the battlefield did not mean the battlefield left him. His wife, Laura Miller, had once been a warm, observant woman with shoulder-length chestnut hair, fair skin that freckled easily in summer, and brown eyes that had always noticed when Dan was pretending to be fine. She had loved fiercely, but had grown tired of speaking through locked doors. Dan's nightmares, silence, anger, and refusal to seek help slowly pushed them apart. They separated, and in 2017, Laura died after a prolonged illness. That loss was cruel in a different way. Dan had been alive. He simply had not truly been there. By 2018, the job disappeared, then the apartment, then the last illusion that he still knew how ordinary life worked. The Tahoe became shelter. Ranger became routine. Dan sometimes skipped meals so the dog would not. On freezing nights, he pulled Ranger against him beneath the same blanket. On bad mornings, Ranger was the reason Dan opened the door. Neither would have called it rescue. It was simply what partners did. One autumn afternoon in 2019, Dan and Ranger were walking along a quiet road on the outskirts of Colorado Springs when Ranger suddenly stopped. His ears rose. His body tightened. Then he bolted toward a wooden fence bordering a sprawling estate. Ranger, Dan followed. On the far side lay a teenage girl beside a fallen riding helmet, one boot still caught awkwardly near the stirrup of a frightened horse. Ranger reached her first. Dan vaulted the fence. The girl was 17, slim and pale, with long auburn hair tangled with dust, delicate features, green eyes widened by pain, and the guarded expression of someone who had learned not to expect adults to stay long. Her name, Dan would soon learn, was Sophie Harrison. "Don't move," Dan said calmly. "Look at me." "I'm fine." "No, you're scared. Different thing." That made her blink. He checked her breathing, neck, pupils, and legs, kept her talking, and used her phone to contact the house. Minutes later, a pickup truck came racing down the private drive. The man who stepped out was Frank Dawson, 64, the estate manager. Frank was stocky and weather-beaten, with white hair cut close, a gray mustache, sun-darkened skin, and the deliberate movements of a man who had spent most of his life fixing problems before anyone else noticed them. Years of managing wealthy people's property had made him suspicious of charm and respectful of competence. He looked at Sophie, then Dan, then Ranger, sitting protectively beside her. "You military used to be." Frank's eyes moved to Dan's hands, then the old Tahoe parked beyond the fence. Later, after Sophie had been taken inside and examined, Frank found Dan near the road. "You know engines?" "Enough." "Generators?" "Yes." "Woodworking?" Dan paused. "My father would be offended if I said no." Frank almost smiled. There was an old workshop behind the estate that needed repairs. Tools, machinery, doors, wiring. A few weeks of work. And beside it stood an unused staff room. Dan looked at Ranger. Ranger looked toward the estate as if the decision had already been made. That night, Dan sat on the edge of a narrow bed in the small room behind the workshop. For the first time in more than a year, there were 4 walls, a lock, a ceiling, and heat. He patted the mattress beside him. "Come on, partner." Ranger hesitated only because the jump was higher than it used to be. Dan immediately bent down, slid one arm beneath his chest and the other beneath his hindquarters, and lifted him carefully. "I carried you through Afghanistan. Don't insult me with a mattress." Ranger settled beside him and placed his head across Dan's chest. Dan ran his thumb along the scar on the dog's ear. "A roof," he whispered. Ranger's tail tapped once against the blanket. Dan smiled into the darkness. Across the grounds, lights burned in nearly every window of the Harrison mansion. It looked full. Dan did not yet know that the girl Ranger had found was only the first broken thing waiting behind those walls. For the first few mornings after Dan moved into the staff room behind the workshop, he learned the Harrison estate by sound before he learned it by people. At 6, sprinklers clicked awake across the lawns. At 7, horses shifted in their stalls. By 8, delivery trucks came through the service gate. The mansion itself remained strangely quiet. From the workshop windows, Dan could see its pale stone walls, tall windows, and broad terrace facing the mountains. Yet he rarely saw anyone gathered in the same room. It reminded him of abandoned command posts he had seen overseas. Everything still standing, everything technically functioning, but the people inside no longer operating as one unit. The estate belonged to Robert Harrison, 61, founder of Harrison Equipment, a regional construction machinery company that had grown from 3 rented excavators into a business worth more money than Dan could comfortably imagine. Robert was a tall, heavily built man with iron gray hair combed neatly back, a square jaw softened slightly by age, deep-set hazel eyes, and a closely trimmed gray beard. Photographs around the estate showed him smiling more easily in earlier years. Since his wife's death, according to Frank, Robert had become controlled almost to the point of severity. He spoke politely to employees, rarely raised his voice, paid everyone on time, and remembered invoices more reliably than birthdays. Grief had not made him cruel. It had made him absent. His wife, Grace Harrison, had died from cancer 18 months earlier. Dan knew her only through photographs at first. A slender woman in her early 50s with warm auburn hair, pale freckled skin, gentle green eyes, and the kind of open smile that made everyone beside her seem more relaxed. Frank said Grace had known every stable hand by name, brought soup to sick employees, and could somehow tell when one of her children was lying before they finished the first sentence. Her illness had lasted long enough for the family to watch her weaken, and short enough that none of them had learned how to live without her. Robert responded by working harder. He traveled constantly, Denver, Dallas, Chicago, New York, and explained every absence as necessary for the company and therefore necessary for his children. Frank never criticized his employer directly, but one morning while helping Dan move a rusted table saw, he said, "Mister, Harrison keeps building things for those kids because building is what he knows." Dan tightened a bolt. "And what do they need?" Frank looked toward the mansion. "Probably something that can't be delivered by truck." Dan understood that kind of failure better than he wanted to. The oldest Harrison child was Luke, 24, a tall, lean young man with dark blonde hair kept short at the sides, a clean-shaven, angular face, and his father's hazel eyes without his father's patience. Before Grace became seriously ill, Luke had been studying for an MBA and preparing to enter the family company. After her death, he quit the program and came home. He had since developed the habit of checking locks, bills, staff schedules, even Sophie's school attendance, as though enough control could prevent another catastrophe. To employees, he was never openly rude, but he spoke in clipped sentences and distrusted anyone whose purpose in the house he could not immediately define. The middle child, Caleb, 20, was almost Luke's opposite in appearance and temperament. He had thick brown hair that was usually untidy, a softer face, warm brown eyes, and an athletic build beginning to lose definition from too many late nights. He was charming when he wanted something, and funny whenever conversation threatened to become serious. Frank described him as the boy who could make Grace laugh during chemotherapy appointments. Since her death, that humor had become camouflage. Caleb stayed out late, gambled online, drank more than anyone admitted, and had developed an increasingly private relationship with prescription painkillers. Sophie was different from both brothers. After the riding accident, she began appearing at the workshop almost every afternoon. At first, she came for Ranger. She would sit on the floor near the open door, brush burrs from his black and tan coat, inspect the small scar on his ear, or simply lean against his side while Dan worked. Ranger accepted her with the quiet certainty he gave very few people. Some days, Sophie barely spoke at all. Dan never forced conversation. He knew silence could be either a wall or a shelter, and it was better to let the person inside decide when to open the door. One rainy afternoon, Sophie spent nearly an hour brushing Ranger while Dan rebuilt the carburetor of an old generator. "Does Ranger know you were homeless?" she asked suddenly. Dan glanced over. Ranger was asleep with his head across Sophie's boot. "He doesn't care." Sophie looked down at him. "What does he care about?" Dan wiped grease from his fingers. "Whether I'm there when he opens his eyes." Sophie stopped brushing. Something shifted across her face. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. She did not ask another question. 2 days later, Caleb appeared in the doorway. "I'm looking for Sophie." "She's at the stables." Caleb nodded, then noticed Ranger. He pulled a wrapped piece of roast beef from his jacket pocket. "Can he have this?" Dan raised an eyebrow. "You carry roast beef around often?" Caleb grinned. "Emergency supplies." Dan checked that it was plain before allowing it. Caleb crouched, gave Ranger the meat, scratched under his collar, then left as casually as he had arrived. The following day, he returned with another piece. Then again, 3 days later. Dan never mentioned the pattern. Ranger did not either. Luke took considerably longer. He arrived one cold afternoon while Dan was underneath a riding mower. Dan heard expensive shoes stop beside the Tahoe before Luke entered the workshop. "Frank says you slept in that vehicle." Dan rolled out from beneath the mower. "I did. And now you're living on our property." For the moment, Luke studied him carefully. His gaze moved over Dan's worn clothes, the faded backpack near the workbench, then Ranger resting beside the heater. "How long are you planning to stay?" Dan turned back to the engine. "Until I finish what I was hired to repair." Luke glanced at the shelves, broken cabinets, rusted machinery, and leaking corner of the roof. "There's a lot broken around here." Dan tightened the bolt, then looked past Luke toward the distant mansion. "I noticed." Luke's jaw hardened. He understood perfectly. Dan watched him leave and immediately regretted the comment. Not because it was false, but because it had struck a wound he had no right to touch yet. That evening, Sophie came by. Caleb did not. Neither did Luke. But Ranger spent most of dinner facing the mansion instead of Dan. His ears lifted at sounds Dan could barely hear. Once, near midnight, he stood and moved to the door. "Something wrong?" Dan asked. Ranger remained perfectly still, staring toward the second floor of the Harrison house. Then he gave a low, uneasy whine. Dan looked through the dark toward the mansion. One upstairs window was still glowing. He did not know whose room it was. Ranger apparently did. And for the rest of the night, the old dog refused to sleep facing anywhere else. At 4:17 in the morning, Dan woke to the sound of Ranger's claws striking the wooden door. He knew immediately it was not a request to go outside. After 9 years together, Dan understood Ranger's language almost as well as his own. A soft paw meant impatience. A low whine meant discomfort. 2 short barks usually meant someone was approaching. This was different. Ranger scratched hard, stopped to listen, then scratched again, his entire body rigid. Dan was out of bed before he was fully awake. "Show me." The moment the door opened, Ranger shot across the dark yard toward the Harrison mansion. Dan pulled on his boots and followed, calling Frank as he ran. Ranger reached the side entrance and began barking. Lights came on in the manager's cottage, and less than 2 minutes later, Frank arrived with his master keys, his jacket thrown over his pajamas. "What the hell is happening?" "I don't know," Dan said. "Trust the dog." Frank did. The side door opened. Ranger raced through the silent kitchen, crossed the main hall, and bounded upstairs. Dan followed, his heartbeat accelerating for reasons that had little to do with running. There was something disturbingly familiar about following Ranger toward danger, while everyone else was still trying to understand whether danger existed. Ranger stopped outside Caleb's bedroom and scratched furiously. "Caleb!" Frank called. Nothing. He knocked harder. Still nothing. Dan tried the handle. Locked. Frank searched through his keys, but Caleb had apparently turned the interior privacy lock. Dan stepped back. "Move." Frank struck the door near the latch with his shoulder. It held. Dan joined him on the second attempt. The frame cracked, and on the third, the door burst inward. Caleb lay unconscious on the carpet beside his bed. An overturned glass of water had soaked into the rug. A prescription bottle sat on the nightstand beside a second bottle of over-the-counter nighttime cold medicine. Dan immediately noticed the space heater running near the bed, the heavy blankets, and the room's unusual warmth. Caleb had apparently come home feeling sick, taken his prescribed medication, later taken cold medicine without realizing the combination could make him dangerously drowsy, then collapsed while trying to get out of bed. There was no note, no liquor, and nothing suggesting he had intended to harm himself. It looked like a frightening medication mistake made worse by exhaustion and illness. Dan's body reacted before his mind had time to remember anyone else he had ever found lying still. He dropped beside Caleb, checked his responsiveness and breathing, and kept his airway clear while Frank called emergency services. Ranger stood several feet away, trembling with restrained urgency, his amber eyes fixed on Caleb. "Stay with me, kid," Dan murmured. Caleb did not respond. For one terrible second, the carpet disappeared beneath Dan's knees. He remembered dust, shattered concrete, and Chris lying beyond his reach. Dan forced the memory away. Not now. This was Colorado. This was Caleb. And this time, help was coming. The paramedics arrived quickly. By sunrise, Caleb was on his way to the hospital. Sophie stood at the top of the stairs, wrapped in a blanket, pale and frightened. Luke stood beside her, motionless, all his usual control gone. Neither spoke as the stretcher passed. Ranger watched until Caleb disappeared through the front door. Only then did he sit. Dan knelt beside him and rested a hand against his neck. "You found him." Ranger leaned heavily against Dan's knee. 2 days later, Caleb was awake and recovering. Dan waited until the family had visited before going to the hospital. He almost turned around twice. Hospitals carried too many ghosts. Laura's weakening body wounded teammates, fluorescent hallways where people waited for news that divided their lives into before and after. But Ranger was with him. The dog could not enter the patient area, so he remained with Frank beyond a glass partition near the corridor. When Dan entered Caleb's room, the young man looked exhausted and embarrassed more than anything else. His brown hair was unwashed, his face pale, and dark shadows rested beneath his eyes. Caleb looked through the glass and spotted Ranger sitting there like a sentry. "Who found me?" he asked. Dan nodded toward the corridor. "He did." Caleb stared at Ranger. "Of course he did. What does that mean? He'd been watching me for days." Dan remembered Ranger staring toward the mansion at night. Apparently Caleb had noticed too. After a moment, Caleb rubbed both hands over his face. "That was stupid." "It was dangerous," Dan corrected quietly. "There's a difference." Caleb swallowed. "The doctor said I mixed things I shouldn't have mixed. I wasn't trying to do anything. I just wanted to sleep because I felt terrible. I know. I could have died because I didn't read 2 labels." Dan pulled a chair closer. "People make mistakes when they're tired, sick, scared, or trying to handle too much alone. Surviving one means you get the chance to learn from it." Caleb looked toward Ranger again. "That dog keeps noticing things nobody else does." A faint smile touched Dan's face. Annoying habit. That earned the smallest laugh from Caleb. Dan did not turn the conversation into a lecture. Instead, he told Caleb about Chris. Not about wishing he had died in Chris's place, but about the guilt of believing every terrible outcome could somehow have been prevented if Dan had been smarter, faster, or more careful. Chris had saved Dan more than once, yet in 2015, Dan had made a battlefield decision that still haunted him. "For years, I kept replaying those minutes," Dan said, "like there was some perfect answer hidden inside them." "Did you find one?" "No." Caleb frowned. "Then how do you live with it?" Dan glanced through the glass at Ranger. "You stop pretending you have to carry everything alone." Caleb followed his gaze. A week later, after speaking with his doctors and his family, Caleb voluntarily entered a structured recovery and counseling program to address the drinking, poor sleep, gambling, and unhealthy habits that had been building since Grace's death. The accident had frightened him enough to admit that he needed help before another careless decision became irreversible. Dan did not congratulate him as though the battle were finished. He simply shook Caleb's hand before he left. When Caleb eventually returned to the estate, he began spending mornings in the workshop. At first, he swept floors. Then Dan taught him to clean tools, replace belts, and rebuild a small engine. Ranger usually slept between them, occasionally opening one eye whenever Caleb dropped something. One afternoon, Sophie was brushing Ranger when she noticed his right hind leg trembling. "Dan." He looked over immediately. His leg. Dan was beside Ranger within seconds, running practiced fingers gently along the joint. Sophie watched his face. "Does it hurt him?" "Some days. You take him to a vet regularly." Ranger licked Dan's wrist as though the examination were unnecessary. Sophie looked at the silver spreading across the old dog's muzzle, then at Dan. "You're scared, aren't you?" Dan could have made a joke. This time he did not. He kept one hand resting over Ranger's paw. "Yeah." Sophie had never heard him admit fear before. Dan looked down at the companion who had followed him from Afghanistan to an empty apartment, from that apartment to an old Tahoe, and finally to this strange estate where neither of them had expected to belong. He had survived losing almost everyone he loved. That did not mean he had learned how to lose the one who remained. Behind the Harrison mansion, beyond the horse paddocks and a row of old cottonwoods turning gold in the Colorado autumn, stood a greenhouse that had been locked for nearly 2 years. Sophie brought Dan there 3 weeks after Caleb returned from treatment. The greenhouse was long and narrow, built from white painted timber and glass, though time had turned the wood gray, and several panes had cracked beneath snow and wind. Dead vines clung stubbornly to wire trellises. Clay pots lay overturned beneath benches covered in dust. At the far end stood an old wooden chair facing the mountains. "Mom used to sit there," Sophie said. Dan looked at the chair but did not touch it. Sophie explained that Grace had spent countless mornings there, growing roses, lavender, herbs, and vegetables she often gave to employees. During the early months of her illness, she had continued gardening whenever she had enough strength. Then, one winter afternoon, she locked the greenhouse and never returned. "I want to open it again," Sophie said. "Not clean it out, not change it, just Make it alive. Dan understood the distinction. Then we repair what's broken, he said. We don't erase what was here. They began with the door. Moisture had swollen the frame, one hinge had nearly rusted through, and two lower support beams were rotten. Dan removed only what could no longer be saved. Sophie labeled old pots before moving them, determined that nothing belonging to Grace should disappear accidentally. Ranger lay in a patch of sunlight near the entrance, occasionally lifting his silvering muzzle whenever Sophie passed. Caleb joined them the next morning. Treatment had not transformed him into a different person. Some days he talked too much, other days he barely spoke, but he arrived sober, carrying work gloves and 2 coffees. Dan gave him a measuring tape instead of praise. Window frame, east wall. Caleb looked at the damaged wood. You trust me with that? No, Dan said. That's why I'm standing here. Caleb laughed, and for once the joke did not sound like camouflage. Luke discovered them that afternoon. What are you doing? Sophie turned. Fixing Mom's greenhouse. Luke's expression hardened immediately. No. Dan stopped sanding. Luke, Sophie began. I said no. Leave her things alone. It's falling apart. Then let it fall apart. The words seemed to surprise even Luke. His eyes moved toward Grace's chair, and something frightened crossed his face before control returned. Dan recognized it. Sometimes grief preferred ruins because repairing them felt too much like admitting the dead were not coming back. Dan set down the sandpaper. It's your family's greenhouse. If you want me to stop, I stop. Luke looked almost disappointed that Dan had not challenged him. He left. For the next 3 days, Sophie and Caleb worked only outside, repairing drainage and clearing fallen branches without entering the greenhouse. On the 4th morning, Luke appeared carrying a red metal toolbox. Caleb glanced at him but wisely said nothing. Luke put the box down. That east frame is crooked. You volunteering? Dan asked. No. I just don't want you 3 destroying it. Fair enough. No one smiled. By afternoon, all 4 were working. While removing a damaged panel beneath one of the planting benches, Sophie found a low cabinet hidden behind stacked terracotta pots. Inside were gardening catalogs, seed packets, old photographs, and several cloth-bound notebooks. Grace's handwriting filled them. They expected gardening records. Instead, between notes about roses and tomato seedlings, Grace had written about her family. Sophie read first. Luke tries so hard to look strong when Robert is watching. I wish he understood that his father is already proud of him. Luke thinks love is something he must earn by never failing. Luke stared at the page. Give me that. Sophie handed him the notebook. He read the passage again. Then Caleb found his name. Caleb jokes most on the days when something hurts him. Everyone laughs, so no one asks why he needed them to. Caleb's smile vanished. That's unfair, he whispered. Dan looked at him. Because it's wrong. Caleb swallowed. Because it isn't. Sophie turned several pages before finding herself. My Sophie believes she is afraid of losing me. I think her deeper fear is that after I leave, everyone else will leave too. Sophie stopped breathing for a moment. Ranger rose, crossed the greenhouse, and pressed his shoulder against her leg. She buried her fingers in his fur. Luke continued reading until he found an entry about their father. Robert builds walls because he thinks walls protect people. He has spent his whole life building a safe world for us. What he does not understand is that sometimes the walls meant to protect a family leave him standing outside it. Luke read the passage twice. Then he quietly closed the notebook. Nobody spoke. That evening, Dan returned to his room exhausted. Ranger climbed onto the bed with more difficulty than before, and Dan gave him the usual support beneath his chest and hindquarters. Don't start getting old on me, he murmured. Ranger licked his wrist. Sometime after midnight, something heavy crashed outside the workshop. Dan came awake violently. For several seconds, Colorado disappeared. The darkness became Afghanistan. His lungs locked. His hands trembled. Somewhere inside his memory, someone was shouting Chris's name. Then Ranger moved. The old shepherd pressed his body against Dan's legs and pushed his head beneath Dan's shaking hand. Dan gripped his fur. Ranger! The dog stayed. Dan felt the scarred ear beneath his fingers. The wooden floor returned. The bed. The workshop. Colorado. Home. His breathing slowly steadied. A movement near the doorway caught his attention. Sophie was outside. She had apparently come from the stables after hearing the same crash. She did not enter. She simply sat on the step and waited until Dan looked at her. Ranger does that every time. she asked quietly. Yeah. How long? Dan looked down at him. 9 years. Sophie studied the aging dog. He must be tired. A faint smile crossed Dan's face. No, he enjoys pretending he's the only adult in the room. Sophie laughed softly. Dan bent and kissed Ranger between the ears. Neither noticed Luke standing farther down the path. Luke had seen enough. For weeks he had regarded Dan as another outsider trying to enter the broken spaces of his family. Now he understood something he had missed. Dan had never arrived stronger than them. He simply recognized broken people because he knew what it was to break. The next morning, Luke was already waiting at the greenhouse when Dan arrived. The red toolbox sat beside his feet. He did not apologize. He did not offer friendship. He simply pointed toward the damaged western frame. That one needs replacing too. Dan looked at him for a moment, then handed him a hammer. By the middle of October, the first snow had begun whitening the distant peaks above Colorado Springs, while inside Grace Harrison's greenhouse, new green shoots were pushing through fresh soil. Grace's birthday arrived on a clear Saturday. For the Harrison children, it was the first anniversary connected to their mother that they had chosen to face rather than endure separately. Sophie replanted lavender, white roses, rosemary, and the small yellow chrysanthemums Grace had loved because, as Sophie remembered her saying, they look cheerful even when nobody else is trying. Caleb built a simple wooden bench from reclaimed oak Dan had found behind the workshop. The joints were imperfect, and one leg had required 3 attempts, but Caleb refused Dan's offer to finish it. Luke restored Grace's old tabletop radio, replacing corroded wiring and polishing the wooden casing until it looked almost as it had in the photographs. When everything was ready, Sophie found Dan outside the workshop cleaning grease from his hands. We're starting at 4. Dan nodded. Have a good afternoon. Sophie stared at him. That means you're coming. No, it means you should have a good afternoon. Dan. He glanced toward the greenhouse. That's your mother's place. Today belongs to your family. Sophie pointed at Ranger, who was stretched beside Dan's boots, enjoying the autumn sun. Ranger is family. Dan looked down. And me? Ranger won't come without you. Dan stared at the old shepherd. Ranger stared back. You sold me out again. Ranger thumped his tail once. Dan rubbed the scarred ear with unmistakable affection. Some teammate. At 4, Dan entered the greenhouse with Ranger beside him. There was no ceremony. No expensive flowers had been delivered. No caterers waited outside. Sophie had placed several photographs of Grace among the plants. Caleb's bench stood near her old chair. Luke's repaired radio played softly from a shelf. They simply talked. Sophie remembered how Grace used to sing badly while gardening and insist she was improvising. Caleb told the story of the time she chased him through the kitchen with a wooden spoon after discovering he had replaced sugar with salt before a charity luncheon. Luke resisted longest, then finally remembered being 16 and crashing Robert's vintage pickup into the garden wall. Grace had discovered him first. What did she do? Sophie asked. Luke smiled. She looked at the truck, looked at the wall, and said, Your father is going to kill you, so you should probably eat something first. Caleb laughed so hard he nearly fell from his bench. Even Dan laughed. Then Luke's smile faded. She sat with me until Dad came home. The greenhouse became quiet. Dan understood what Luke had not said. She stayed. Ranger moved between the siblings and settled near their feet. None of them knew that Robert Harrison had returned to Colorado Springs nearly 2 days earlier than planned. For several weeks, one of Robert's longtime business associates had been feeding his anxiety during phone calls. A homeless former serviceman had been allowed to live on the estate. The man was spending considerable time with Robert's children. Sophie trusted him, Caleb worked beside him, and Luke had apparently stopped objecting to his presence. The warnings were framed as concern. Questions about liability, boundaries, money, and whether Dan might be exploiting a grieving family. From hundreds of miles away, Robert had listened, and suspicion had found fertile ground in guilt. He entered the house shortly before 4, learned from a member of the staff that all 3 children were at Grace's greenhouse, and walked there alone. He stopped outside the glass door. Inside, Caleb was sober and laughing. Sophie, who had begun attending school regularly again, sat cross-legged near Ranger. Luke, who had recently contacted his university about returning to complete his studies, was leaning against the restored workbench, and between them sat Dan. Robert should have felt relief. Instead, something painful twisted inside him. His children looked safe. They also looked at another man with a trust Robert could no longer remember receiving himself. The door opened. Everyone turned. "Dad?" Sophie stood. Robert's eyes moved from her to Caleb, then Luke, then Dan. "When were you planning to tell me this was happening?" Luke frowned. "Tell you what?" Robert gestured around the greenhouse. "This. Your mother's things. This place. Him." Dan stood immediately. "Mr. Harrison, you stay out of this." Dan's expression remained calm. Luke stepped forward. "Don't talk to him like that." Robert stared at his eldest son. "Excuse me, he helped us repair this place. I didn't authorize him to rebuild your mother's greenhouse." "We did. You are living in my house." "And you aren't." The words struck harder than Luke intended. Robert's face changed. "Luke, no, Dad, you don't get to disappear for weeks and months and then come back and decide who we're allowed to trust." Sophie whispered, "Luke." But he had spent 18 months swallowing those words. Robert looked at Caleb. Healthy color had begun returning to his face. Then Sophie. Then the repaired greenhouse. Everything in front of him proved his children were improving, and somehow that made the wound worse, because it had happened without him. "You think he understands this family?" Robert asked. Luke answered quietly. "He was here." Silence. Dan stepped between the argument before it could deepen. "Mr. Harrison, this is your property. Frank hired me for repair work. If you want me gone, I'll go." Robert looked at him for a long moment. "Finish whatever work remains in the workshop." Dan nodded. "Then leave." Sophie's face crumpled. Caleb looked away. Luke clenched his jaw. Dan did not argue. The next morning, his faded backpack went into the Tahoe first, then his tools, then Ranger's blanket and water bowl. Dan opened the rear door. "Come on, partner." Ranger approached, but he did not climb inside. Instead, he turned toward the greenhouse. Sophie stood there. Caleb and Luke were behind her. Dan crouched and took Ranger's old face gently between his hands. "I know." Ranger pressed his forehead against Dan's chest. Dan closed his eyes. "We've left a lot of places." His thumb moved across the silver fur around Ranger's muzzle. "This one's harder, isn't it?" Footsteps pounded across the gravel. Dan. Frank was running from the direction of the estate storage building, carrying a weathered wooden box against his chest. "I found this behind Grace's things." Dan stood. Frank opened the lid. Inside were several old personal belongings, photographs, folded papers, and one small object wrapped carefully in faded cloth. Frank uncovered it. Dan stopped breathing. The Harrison children saw only an old military object. Dan saw something else. Something he had not seen since Afghanistan. For several seconds, Dan stood beside the open Tahoe without touching the object in Frank's hands. Ranger moved closer until his shoulder rested against Dan's leg, as though the old dog had already recognized the change in him. The object inside Grace's wooden box was an old laminated playing card, worn cloudy at the edges from years of handling. On the back, written in faded black ink, were two things: Grace Harrison and a date from 2013. Robert had followed his children from the greenhouse when he saw Frank running across the estate. The moment he noticed the card, his expression changed. "I know that." Frank handed it to him. Robert turned it over carefully. "This belonged to Thomas." Dan looked up. "Thomas who?" "Thomas Harrison, Grace's younger brother." The name meant nothing. Not yet. Robert explained that Thomas Harrison had been Grace's only sibling, a U.S. Army combat medic in his early 30s when he died in Afghanistan in 2013. In the photographs Grace had kept, Thomas was lean and broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair, sun-weathered skin, an easy crooked smile, and the same green eyes as his sister. He had been the kind of man who made friends quickly and wrote home faithfully, often mailing Grace ridiculous postcards from military bases just to make her laugh. According to the Army, Thomas had been critically wounded during an attack and died before reaching higher-level medical care. "That's all we were told," Robert said. He looked down at the card. Months later, Grace received this from a soldier named Chris Walker. Dan stopped breathing. Robert continued, unaware of what the name had done. There was a short note saying Thomas had asked that it be sent to her. Grace tried to find out more, but she never got much beyond the official report. Dan reached for the card. His fingers trembled before touching it. Chris Walker. Robert frowned. "You knew him?" Dan stared at the faded date. Ranger pressed harder against his leg. "Where exactly did Thomas die?" Robert gave the region. Dan sat down heavily on the edge of the Tahoe. 6 years disappeared. The dust came back first, then broken concrete, a partially collapsed structure, Ranger disappearing through debris and barking from somewhere Dan could not see. A wounded soldier beneath the wreckage. Dan closed his eyes. Oh, God. Sophie stepped closer. Dan? He opened his eyes and looked at Robert. I knew you're Thomas. Nobody moved. Dan's voice became quieter. Not his name. Not then. The memory unfolded in fragments. Ranger had located Thomas beneath collapsed material after the attack. Dan and Chris reached him and managed to get him free. Thomas was badly injured but conscious. They moved him toward evacuation while Ranger stayed close. He knew he was dying, Dan said. Robert's face tightened. Did he suffer? It was the question families asked when they had spent years building kinder versions of the unknown. Dan could have lied. Yes. Robert lowered his head. Dan continued gently. We did everything we could for the pain, but yes, he hurt. Robert swallowed. Was he afraid? Yes. Sophie began crying silently. Luke put an arm around her. Robert's voice cracked. Thank you for not lying. Dan looked again at the card, but he wasn't alone. Robert lifted his eyes. Chris held his hand. I stayed beside the litter. Ranger was lying against his leg whenever we stopped. At the sound of his name, Ranger raised his head. Dan remembered Thomas speaking between breaths, sometimes clearly, sometimes drifting. He talked about his sister. Robert covered his mouth. He said grace. More than once. Dan's own eyes had filled now. He talked about Colorado, mountains, summer trails you could walk before the afternoon storms came. He said his sister always carried too much water because she thought everyone was going to die of dehydration. A broken laugh escaped Robert. That was Grace. He had this card in a pocket. He gave it to Chris, asked him to get it to her if he didn't make it. Dan looked down. Chris promised, and Chris had kept that promise. For years, Dan had remembered the wounded medic only as another face he could not save. Grace had remembered a brother whose final moments she could only imagine. Neither had known the other existed. There had been no secret arrangement. Grace had never known Dan's name. Dan had never known Thomas was connected to the Harrisons. 6 years later, Ranger had simply heard Sophie in trouble beyond offense and reacted. Nothing more. Yet standing there beside an old Chevrolet Tahoe, coincidence felt almost too small a word. Robert's knees seemed to weaken. He sat on the workshop step. My wife's brother died beside you. Dan shook his head. Beside us. He rested his hand on Ranger. This guy too. Robert looked at the old shepherd for a long time, then at the packed Tahoe. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. Robert stood. I didn't tell you to leave because I thought you were dangerous. Dan waited. Robert's composure finally broke. I told you to leave because my children look at you the way they used to look at me. Luke lowered his gaze. Robert's voice trembled. I came home and saw Caleb sober, Sophie back at school, Luke planning his future again. I should have thanked God. He wiped his eyes. Instead, I was jealous. Dan did not comfort him. He knew some truths needed room. Finally, he said, Then stay. Robert stared at him. What? Stay here. Dan nodded toward the house. Not tonight. Not for a weekend. Stay long enough that they stop wondering when you're leaving again. Robert gave a tearful laugh. You make it sound simple. No. Dan looked at his own packed vehicle. I make it sound possible. After a moment, Robert asked, Where are you going? Dan looked toward the road beyond the gates. I don't know. Robert nodded slowly. Then don't go. Before Dan could answer, Ranger walked several feet onto the grass, circled once and lay down. Sophie laughed through her tears. Dan stared at him. Seriously, Ranger rested his head on his paws. Traitor. Sophie ran forward and wrapped both arms around Ranger's neck. Caleb came beside Dan and placed a hand on his shoulder. Luke remained a few steps away, pretending to study the ground while wiping quickly at his eyes. Dan looked at Robert, then at the 3 children, then at Ranger, who clearly considered the matter settled. All right. Dan sighed. 2 votes against 1. Robert smiled. For the first time, he understood what Dan had actually done. Dan had never come to replace him. He had simply kept the door open long enough for a father to find his way home. 2 years later, autumn returned to Colorado Springs with gold cottonwoods, cold blue mornings, and the first white dusting of snow along the distant Rockies. The Harrison estate no longer felt like the beautiful mausoleum Dan had first seen from the workshop. Grace's greenhouse remained almost exactly as they had restored it, filled with lavender, roses, rosemary, chrysanthemums, and the old radio Luke had repaired. But the workshop had changed completely. What began as a temporary repair job had grown into a small rehabilitation program for struggling veterans who needed practical skills, steady work, and a place where nobody demanded that they explain every scar before being trusted with a wrench. Dan managed the program. He taught engine repair, basic carpentry, equipment maintenance, and the lesson his father had given him decades earlier. Find out why something broke before deciding it should be thrown away. Dan never used the sentence as a metaphor. He did not need to. The men understood. Luke had completed his studies and now helped with contracts, insurance, employment paperwork, and the legal structure of the program. Caleb remained committed to recovery. Some weeks were harder than others, and he never pretended otherwise, but he had begun volunteering with young adults struggling with addiction. Sophie was preparing for college, determined to study veterinary medicine. Robert still ran Harrison equipment, but his life was no longer measured by airport lounges. He ate dinner at home. He knew Sophie's examination schedule, Caleb's support group nights, and when Luke was worried, even when Luke insisted he was fine. Sometimes Robert came down to the workshop with 2 coffees, handed one to Dan, and sat beside him without discussing business at all. Ranger had changed too. At 11, his muzzle had turned almost completely silver. His amber eyes remained sharp, but his hind legs had weakened. Dan adjusted their life without announcing that he was doing so. Their walks became shorter. A thick, orthopedic bed appeared beside Dan's workbench. A low wooden step stood beside Dan's bed, so Ranger no longer needed to jump. On cold mornings, Dan warmed the old shepherd's joints with his hands before they went outside. He never treated Ranger as fragile. He simply cared for the friend who had spent years caring for him. One October morning, the Harrison family gathered at Grace's greenhouse for her birthday. Ranger walked beside Dan across the lawn at his own stubborn pace. At the 3 wooden steps leading inside, Ranger placed one front paw on the first step. His hind legs slipped. Dan caught him immediately. Ranger tried to lean forward again. No. Dan crouched. "We're not proving anything today, partner." He slid one arm beneath Ranger's chest and the other beneath his hindquarters and lifted him. For an instant, another world returned. Afghanistan. A younger Ranger injured and exhausted. Dan carrying him through dust toward evacuation while repeating the same desperate command. "You don't get to leave me, partner." Now there was no dust, no shouting, no desperate race against time, only an old dog being carried into a greenhouse filled with morning sunlight. Dan lowered Ranger onto a folded blanket beside his chair. Sophie immediately knelt and gently checked his hind leg. "He's okay," Dan said. "I know." She checked anyway. Caleb brought a bowl of water. Luke opened one of the greenhouse panels so the warm sunlight reached Ranger's blanket. Robert pulled his chair closer to Dan. Ranger rested his head across Dan's worn boot. Dan looked down at him. 11 years. War. Chris. Laura. The Tahoe. Winter nights when Dan had counted coins before deciding whether he could afford food and fuel. Mornings when he had awakened unsure where they would sleep next. Ranger had been there for all of it. Dan rested his palm on the silver fur behind his ears. "You've done enough." Ranger's tail moved once against the blanket. On the greenhouse wall hung 2 photographs. One showed Grace with Robert, Luke, Caleb, and Sophie years before illness entered their lives. The second had taken months to locate after the discovery of Thomas's identity. Old military records and personal photographs had eventually led the family to an image from the 2013 deployment. Thomas standing beside Chris Walker and Dan with a much younger Ranger near their boots. Robert walked toward it. He studied Thomas's face for a long time. "You tried to bring him home to us." Dan remained silent. Robert turned toward his children. Luke was adjusting the old radio. Caleb and Sophie were quietly arguing about whether Ranger needed another blanket. Robert smiled. "Maybe it was our turn to bring you home." Dan lowered his eyes. For years, he had imagined himself as the last soldier of a formation that no longer existed. Chris was gone. Thomas was gone. Laura was gone. Nothing about this new life changed those truths. No one replaced them. Nothing could. But Sophie was sitting beside Ranger now, one hand resting gently on the old shepherd's shoulder. Caleb was telling Luke that the new storage shelf in the workshop was crooked. Luke was insisting that Caleb had installed it crooked. Frank stood in the doorway, laughing at both of them. Robert poured coffee into a battered mug and handed it to Dan. And finally, Dan understood. A new family did not erase the one he had lost. A new home did not make the old one meaningless. Loving the people who remained was not a betrayal of the people who had gone. Perhaps the human heart was stranger and stronger than he had believed. Perhaps it could be broken until a man was certain nothing living remained inside it, yet somehow still make room when someone knocked. Dan set his coffee aside. He bent down and pressed his forehead gently against Ranger's. For years he had believed he rescued Ranger from that battlefield. Now he understood the old dog had spent the rest of his life returning the favor. Not through one great miracle, through thousands of small ones. Staying beside him through nightmares, walking beside him when there was nowhere to go, finding Sophie beyond a fence, finding Caleb while there was still time, and refusing, long before Dan could believe it himself, to accept that the man beside him belonged nowhere. Ranger opened his eyes and looked at him. Dan smiled. "All right, you were right." The tale moved again. Outside, October wind crossed the Colorado mountains and rattled softly against the greenhouse glass. Inside, people argued, laughed, poured coffee, remembered the dead, and made plans for tomorrow. Dan looked around the room. Then he looked down at Ranger. For the first time in many years, he did not wonder where they would go next. There was nowhere else they needed to go. They were home. Sometimes God's greatest miracles do not come with thunder. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in a second chance, an unexpected family, or a faithful dog who refuses to leave our side. Dan thought he had saved Ranger, but perhaps God sent Ranger to save Dan, one day at a time. In life, we may lose people we can never replace, but opening our hearts again does not mean forgetting them. It means choosing to keep living with the love they left behind. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave a comment and subscribe for more stories of faith, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, your family, and every faithful companion walking beside you.